Hello, happy Monday. Welcome to Prairie Conservation Action Plan's Native Prairie Appreciation Week webinar series. My name is Caitlin Mroz-Sailer, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Sarah Vinge-Mazer from the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Centre will be talking about how to grow a native prairie garden. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities past and present. I am currently on Treaty 4 land. Treaty 4 is an agreement signed by the Crown and Plains Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Assiniboine peoples to share their traditional territories with non-Aboriginal peoples. Further, we acknowledge the Métis peoples of the communities of Fort Qu'Appelle, LeBret, Lestock, and Willowbunch who identify this region as their homeland. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. If you are not on Treaty 4, we ask that you all think of the land you're on, learn about the treaties, and consider your connection to the land. This week is Native Prairie Appreciation Week. Saskatchewan is the only jurisdiction in North America that proclaims Native Prairie Appreciation Week, which is devoted to raising awareness and appreciation of the native grasslands. It is jointly proclaimed by the Saskatchewan Ministries of Agriculture and Environment, as well as the cities of Regina, Saskatoon, Weyburn, and Moose Jaw. In celebration of Native Prairie Appreciation Week, we have 2 more webinars going on. Amanda Muller will be talking about prairie plant identification on June 16th, and on June 17th, Nature Saskatchewan will be talking about species at risk in Saskatchewan. I'd like to mention that all of the Native Prairie Appreciation Week webinar series webinars are, that's a mouthful, are recorded, and they will be available on PCAP's YouTube channel. So just search YouTube for SKPCAP, and you should find our channel, as well as over 100 recorded webinars. If you have any questions during the presentation, in the webinar pop-up, there's a place to type in questions, and I'll moderate questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to type them in as you think of them during the presentation. If you're on a cell phone, you can send it by chat to the organizer. I'd like to take a moment to note that in-kind support for this project has been given by Sarah Vinge-Mazer. I personally am looking forward to today's presentation. I have a very sad native prairie garden I've been working on for the last couple of years. So I'm looking forward to learning more about it. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Sarah Vinge-Mazer. She's a botanist with the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Centre, where she focuses on rare plant conservation. She enjoys teaching others about Saskatchewan's amazing natural flora and the benefits of growing these species at home. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Sarah.
Hello, everybody. Just going to get myself going here. There we go. Happy to join you today, this afternoon. Nice sunny weather, at least where I am. It's been a little dry out there recently, and I know some of the some of the prairie flowers that I've been out looking at were not so happy. So hopefully, with some of this rain, they're going to perk up. Although I know in some areas we probably got a little much rain. Not quite productive in some areas where it was flooding, but. So I'm happy to be here with you today to chat about growing native prairie species in your garden and how you can bring some of that prairie back to your home. I've got a number of different topics to cover today, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have at the end. And hopefully there's something that you can take away from today that will help you get started in your own yard. So I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about what I mean when I say a native plant. So in Saskatchewan, we have plants that have been here for thousands of years. They grow here naturally. They have evolved with the conditions that we have here, and that's what I would consider a native plant. So those are the things that we're going to be talking about. You know, how can we bring those species to our yards or our sites, and how to grow those. So in contrast to that, we have what I would categorize as non-native plants. And those are species that have been transported here, they've been introduced here, whether it was intentional or unintentional. And so they haven't necessarily evolved with the conditions here, but some of them do great. You know, people really love some of these plants, but they just have different things to consider. So on that note, we're going to talk about what is a weed. So a weed is not necessarily a really solid definition for that word. So it can basically be any plant that is growing where it's not wanted. So some people consider a lot of native plants to be weeds where they pop up in the ditch, for example, or say you're growing a vegetable garden and you have, you know, like a Western dock pop up in your garden. People consider that a weed even though it's a native plant. So a weed doesn't necessarily mean that it's non-native or native, but usually has sort of a negative connotation because it's being found where people don't want it. An invasive plant is usually a non-native species that grows very aggressively, and if it's left uncontrolled, it can become a problem. And there are a lot of non-native species that have been introduced that have become problems. Things like purple loosestrife, leafy spurge, scentless chamomile, all those kinds of things, and they're actually very detrimental to our native species, and they escape from yards and they get out into our natural areas and they actually start out competing our native species. And some of these things were introduced unintentionally, but some of them were brought here as garden plants and planted on purpose. And for some of them, at least until relatively recently, they were still being planted. And that's not good, obviously, if they're escaping from your yard and out competing in our natural areas. So I know one of the motivations for folks wanting to grow native species in their yard is to avoid those kinds of situations where they might unintentionally be growing something that can actually be harmful to our natural areas. And then the last thing is just want to touch on what it means to have a cultivar. So cultivar stands for cultivated variety. It may be a native species, but it's been selectively bred to diminish certain qualities or enhance other qualities like character. And because of that selective breeding, it doesn't usually retain the true genetic diversity of the species, like the native variety that we have. And as such, it's usually is not going to necessarily retain those characteristics that are going to make it tolerant to our harsh conditions here. So as an example, I have, on the left here, we have our native Gaillardia species. Now, also called blanket flower. You can buy Gaillardia from your regular garden center, and the picture on the right shows you some of the different color cultivars that you can buy. So you can see that they've definitely been bred to look differently. So usually in this case, they're selecting for color. And again, when I talk about planting native species, I'm not including cultivars of native species in my recommendations, I guess. So for me, I want to stick with the true native species that retain all of that genetic diversity that is tolerant and evolved to stay with our conditions here. And just for a last bit of fun, I'm going to throw in the term wildflower. Wildflower is a really tricky one because people associate it with going out into the wild, and the flowers that grow there are the wildflowers. So some folks think that wildflowers are native species. However, it's also used as a marketing term. So if you go out to buy a seed mix and it says on it, you know, wildflowers, and you think, oh great, native species, I'm going to grow those. Wildflowers, the term wildflower doesn't necessarily mean anything. It means that they are wild to somewhere, but not necessarily to your own site wherever you're located. So if you see the term wildflower used on like a branding or a sort of a marketing thing, you're out at Canadian Tire, or not to pick on them, but just, you know, your everyday store, and you see a mix that says wildflowers, don't assume that those are native species. A lot of them can contain some very weedy, even slightly invasive plants that are non-native species. So we want to avoid those, and I'll talk a little bit about how to make sure that you're sourcing species that are seeds or seedlings that are true native varieties, so we can avoid those wildflower mix-ups. So in my experience, folks tend to want to get into growing native species for several different reasons, but I've found some rather common motivations, I think, in discussing this with people. So I would invite you that if you're interested in growing native species in your yard, think about why you want to do that. What are your motivations? And that will help you determine your species and the look of your site, and will help you get the most out of your garden. So creating pollinator habitat is a really, really common motivation right now. There's lots of media out there about declines in our native bee species and our butterflies and all of those different pollinators. So that's a really common motivation. Some folks are motivated by the notion of using fewer pesticides. Say if you had a lawn and you felt like you had to spray out your dandelions, and you think, okay, well let's replace this with something that's a little friendlier. Reducing water use is another common motivation, and also reducing maintenance in your yard. The fact that these plants are very resistant to pests is a great one. The use of the plants in terms of medicines, or to be able to eat them. So there's lots of things that have traditional uses that folks are excited to grow in their yards and be able to use them. And then another one, and this is sort of where I first came at it, was from a prairie conservation standpoint and also an education standpoint. So in my main job is concentrated on the conservation of our native plant species in Saskatchewan and our native spaces. So for me, to look at urban spaces or other spaces that have been significantly changed from how they used to be in a natural prairie site, I look at that as an opportunity to bring some of these species back to those sites and to restore some of that ecological function that's been lost. And I also really love to use these species as a way to educate folks about our native wildflowers. I see I used the wrong word. It's too easy. I say our native flowers, and get kids really interested in seeing all of the wonderful diversity that we have here in Saskatchewan. I'm coming to you from Treaty 4 territory in Regina. There's not a lot of really easily accessible true prairie that's close to Regina that we can just sort of hop out, walk down a path and go see some. So it's in order to go see it, you have to get in a car, and you have to have access to a car, and you have to go drive out, and you have to take time to do that. So some of these plants and some of these educational values are a little bit far removed. So by bringing them back into our urban areas, we can use that as a way to educate folks about all the wonderful things that we have with our prairie out there. So again, we just invite you to think about why do you want to grow native species, and then that'll help you with your planning. So planning, as I guess any gardener would know, is a really necessary step in order to increase your chance of success with your garden. So, I mean, yes, you can just buy some native seeds and throw them in a flower bed and see what happens. That's perfectly fine. But if you really want to sort of maximize your success, I would invite you to think about the site that you want to grow your species in. Does it get sun? Does it get shade? Is it a low patch? Does it stay wet, or is it dry out really, really fast? Do you have really sandy soils or really clay soils? Do you have weeds that are there already that you're going to have to think about getting rid of before you start planting things? And then also, how do you want your site to look? Do you want it to have that wild look? Do you want it to have do you want to keep it with that sort of neat aesthetic, where you can have a type of plants here and a type of plants here and a type of plants here? And I would just caution that it's difficult to keep native species separated. They tend to mix over time, but it's not impossible. And I would also just invite you to think about the way that your garden is going to look to an outsider. So unfortunately with native species, because they do tend to move around a little bit, they tend towards that sort of wild look over time. And in some urban settings, folks don't understand what it is that you're doing, with growing these native species, and they think it looks like a bunch of weeds. They think it looks kind of messy, because it's a very different aesthetic to what folks are kind of used to seeing, especially if it's in a front yard. So I would just invite you to think about, how it's going to look, and maybe ways that you can engage folks in your neighborhood to say, like, look, this is what I'm doing. You can put up a little sign, Prairie for pollinators, or, if you're growing native raspberries, invite folks to pick them, or, however you might go about that. But unfortunately, in some places, it is seen as a big weedy problem. And you want to make sure that you sort of talk to folks ahead of time if you're starting a new project that's very visible, so that you can educate them on what you're doing. A good example, I think, would be last year in Regina. There was a couple actually of boulevards that had been rebuilt over the past few years, and the city did a wonderful thing. They seeded them with native species. And the thing about native species in non-native areas is that sometimes they grow very big very fast because they don't have a lot of competition. And that's what happened with some of these boulevards. And folks in the area had no idea what had been planted there or why. And all they saw was a boulevard full of weeds that was not being cut down. And they didn't understand the motivation behind it. So there is usually a little bit of education that goes along with planting a very visible site. And if it's your yard, that's a little different than saying, say, planting a garden at a school, right, and being able to put up some signs and that kind of thing. So it's just to give you something to think about there. And the other thing for planning is to make sure that you know what kind of species you want in your flower bed, and think about, what sort of heights, when do you want things to bloom, what kinds of colors do you want. Do you want things that are going to self-seed themselves or be long-lived perennials? Are they going to spread? All that kind of thing. And you're really going to have to get to know your species before you put them in the ground, so that you can have sort of the best chance of things turning out the way that you want them to. The other thing I will say is that if you don't have, like a large, or it doesn't need to be large, it could be very small, but if you don't have a yard per se, and you're thinking, okay, well, what can I do with, some pots on my balcony or that kind of thing? Absolutely, you can grow native species in pots. I would suggest that, again, you look at how much sun and shade you get. Are you going to commit to watering them? Because if they are bound in a pot, you are going to have to do some watering. Whereas if you're planting them into the ground after they're established, generally you don't need to water them. But you're going to want to think about getting very deep pots, because native plants put a lot of effort into growing very large root systems. And so if you have really small pots, they're going to get root bound very easily and probably not be very happy. But it is possible to do. So think about deep pots if that's what you're going to be working with. So unfortunately, as with most gardens, if you have a weedy space, and especially if you have invasive plants there, you're absolutely going to have to work at removing those before you put in any new planting bed. Otherwise, you'll just be fighting very hard for a lot of years. Native plants are good competitors, but they are still outcompeted by our invasive species. As you can see, if you go out to a a native prairie site that is, functioning wonderfully, and leafy spurge shows up, leafy spurge will still outcompete that system. So you want to make sure that if you have things like leafy spurge, if you have quackgrass in your yard, creeping bellflower, absinthe, Canada thistle, all of these things, the list goes on. I didn't want to depress anybody by, putting the entire list of invasive things up here that you might be working with. It is still going to be absolutely necessary for you to get rid of those before you start your planting. Ways to do that in an ecologically friendly manner are to smother it with mulch or newspaper, or to try solar kill with plastic sheets. There are, of course, other alternatives if you need to use pesticides. Sometimes, you know, in a large restoration project, sometimes pesticides are necessary, or your project just isn't going to be successful because the weeds have just taken hold, and those are, you know, acceptable in some circumstances. But if you have the option, try the smothering and the solar kill. And I would just, I guess, remind people that a lot of these invasive species have very extensive root systems underground. They spread by their roots. They spread by rhizomes going out horizontally. So tilling them as a means of getting rid of them won't work. When you attempt to rototill these species, you just chop up the roots, and then plants just sprout from all those root fragments. So it's really an impossible way to try and get rid of things, because you're actually just growing more almost. So you have to go about it a different way. Quackgrass is one of those, creeping bellflowers, well, black, a lot of them. If you try and till them, you're just going to make the problem worse. So, but other than removing your invasive weeds, there really isn't a lot that you need to do for site preparation. You know, native plants don't need perfect soil to grow. You don't need to fertilize it. If you fertilize, you're basically just helping the weeds. You don't need to do a lot of soil preparation or anything like that. Get rid of the weeds, and then you should be good to go. So our, I guess, sort of biggest question of the day is whether you want to plant seeds or seedlings, and some things that you might need to consider for these two types that you might not have considered in the past working with typical garden plants. So if we're looking at seeds, generally, if you buy and start seeds, you're going to have more selection. It's going to be cheaper to start your project. However, germination rates for native species tend to be quite low in any given year, and that's due to them sort of weathering different conditions out in nature. They don't all germinate all at once. They have slightly different conditions that they'll germinate under. So you need to usually plant a lot more seeds than you would, you know, for your tomatoes or that kind of thing. And you might still only get one plant come up, and that's completely normal. It's not that there's anything wrong with those other seeds. They just might germinate in a different year, but they're not all going to come up at once. As I mentioned, our native plants put a lot of energy into growing extensive root systems, and that's how they survive the droughts on the prairie. But with that, they tend to grow much more slowly in the part that we can see above ground. So if you're starting from seeds, chances are you're not going to get flowers in the first year, although some species will still flower, but it just does take a lot longer. And so you can see on my photos here, this is a month's worth of growth for a blazing star. The picture on the left was early May, and the picture on the right was early June. So in that time, all you got was sort of that one leaf. and the roots were very extensive, so it was a very healthy plant. But if you were expecting this plant to flower in the first year, it's not happening. So that's, if you really want to get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of the aesthetics, you're probably going to want to go with seedlings. The other thing is that if you're spreading seeds directly onto the ground instead of growing them in pots and moving them over, it can be very tricky weeding while you're waiting to figure out what these seedlings are. Generally speaking, the weeds grow a lot faster, so sometimes that's a helpful trick. But it is hard to tell things apart when they're really young. So unless you've got, things really marked off well about what you've planted where, and you're really good at your weed seedling identification, sometimes the weeds can get a pretty good head start before you realize that's not the native species that I planted, that's a weed, and going back to get rid of that. But it's still possible to do. So if you are going to use seeds, you're going to want to plant either in the fall or in the spring. So it's getting fairly late now to be putting seeds down onto the ground. You're still welcome to try, but it's just not the best time. So either you can do into pots, as I mentioned, and if you're leaving them in pots, make sure you get a nice deep pot, and also directly onto the soil. It's perfectly fine for native species. Most of our prairie species like a lot of light, so we don't plant those seeds deep. We basically leave them on the surface and just kind of pack them down, but don't really cover them because they won't germinate then. You're going to want a soil mix that is very well drained. And if you are conservation minded, I would consider using peat-free soils. Using peat means that it's been mined out of our very potentially even in Saskatchewan, our northern ecosystems. And the process of removing peat is ecologically damaging. It's a damaging process, at least in the short to mid-term. So a peat-free alternative for your soil mix is best, and you can talk to your garden centers about what some of those are. And the other thing about native plants is it's very, very easy to overwater them. I've done it. I like to grow, some species on a tray under some lights, sort of starting in March. And I want them to succeed so badly. I tend to look at them and think like, oh, are they too dry? Like, let's give them a little bit more water, and then it's too much. So I would suggest less is more with water. Make sure they don't dry out, but make sure you don't overwater because it's so easy to do. An easy way to sort of get around that is if you have, whatever you're growing your seedlings is to put them in a tray. And as long as you've got holes in the bottom of your containers, just put water in the tray so that it can suck the soil or suck the water up from the bottom into the soil. And that way you're less likely to get that mold growth over the top of where your seedlings are germinating. So just remember that patience is key. It's going to take them a lot longer to germinate than, say, your garden tomatoes. Up to 3 weeks is perfectly normal, and even longer than that for some species. And again, patience even when they start growing. So the other thing to consider with your seeds is that you may need to do some pre-treatment on them, either scarification, which is roughing up the seed coat, like breaking the seed coat for the plants, or stratification, which means sort of putting it through a simulated winter and spring, also to help with the germination. So if you're planting things from the legume family, like purple prairie clover or breadroot, things like that, those almost always have a tough seed coat and need to be scratched. So just a light sandpaper even can help scratch the seed coat to help them germinate. And just about for everything that I get, if I'm using seeds, I'll throw them into the freezer in a bag for, I don't know, a couple of 2-3 weeks. I'll throw them in the fridge for another couple, 2-3 weeks after that, and that's my simulated winter and spring. But some of these plants do actually need that stratification in order to germinate. So if you're buying from a reputable native plant seller, usually the instructions will be with those seeds to say, this one's going to need some scarification, this one's going to need some stratification. But you're going to want to get your seeds well ahead of time so that you have the time to put them through those treatments before you actually start planting. So planning and patience, and this is a bit of a longer term endeavor than just grabbing your sunflowers from your local garden center and putting them in a pot outside kind of thing. So if you're going to go with seedlings, you're definitely going to get established plants much more quickly. You're going to get flowers much more quickly, but there tends to be less availability in terms of like the species that you're going to be able to find. And of course, they're more expensive because somebody else has put in the time to water them and put the soil in and take care of them and that kind of thing. So you can see in these are called root trainers, these seedling growing structures. And you can see how small the plants are on the top and just how much of a root that they've already grown. And so these root trainers are really great for growing native plant species because they really allow lots of room for those roots to start stretching down quickly while you're growing them indoors. So if you are working with seedlings, make sure that you give them a bit of time to acclimatize. If they came right out of a greenhouse, make sure you're sort of putting them outside and don't shock them too bad. Although most of the seedlings I've worked with, we've left them outside, without not a lot of care, and they've done just fine. But again, you've spent good money on these things, so let's make sure that that we don't put them through too much stress right off the hop. And then you're going to want to plant them in the spring after last frost, similar to how you would with other gardening. You can plant them later in the season. It's just that you are, I guess, running the risk of one, them not having quite enough time to establish their roots before winter sets in, and then potentially getting, if the roots aren't deep enough, you could potentially freeze, or with the soil movement with freezing, it could actually pop the plug out if it hasn't had enough time to grab in there. And it's also just harder on the plants if you're planting them in, say July, August, just because of the heat of the day and that kind of thing. So they need a little bit more care and watching over to make sure that they don't just dry out right away before their roots have really had time to get down. But I did plant some species, I think mid-July last year, and just kept an eye on them, made sure I gave them enough water until they got established, and they did just fine. So it is possible, it's just not the ideal. Ideal is sort of early June. So if you're going to go with seeds, you have two options. You can either collect seeds yourself, or you can purchase them from a reputable native plant seller. So if you're going to do some seed collection yourself, there are a couple of things to be very mindful of. So first of all is, where are you going to collect these things from? If you're going to be accessing private land, make sure that you have landowner permission to go and do it. And just a note that it is actually illegal to collect from provincial and national parks. So those places are a no-go for collecting species. There are a number of species that will grow in ditches, which it would be permissible to collect seeds from those locations. However, be mindful of your safety, where you're parking, that kind of thing, if that's what you plan to do. And then also make sure that you're very, very familiar with the species that you're collecting from. We do have a number of rare species in Saskatchewan that have common lookalikes, and we want to ensure that we're collecting from the common species and not the rare ones. We also want to be very sure that we're not accidentally collecting invasive weeds. So for example, scentless chamomile is a very nice looking white daisy flower, which, if you didn't know it was invasive, you might think, oh, that's pretty, I'll collect some of that and bring it back. Or Dame's rocket is another one that looks really nice, but it's a terribly invasive species. And if you accidentally collected seeds from that, brought them back to your yard, you're actually spreading invasive species. So we definitely don't want to do that. Some other tips here is make sure that there are, whichever species you're collecting from, make sure there are lots of individuals that you can see in the area, so that you're not just taking the seed from the single plant that's established at that location. So just remember that nature needs those seeds also. So you're going to want to not take more than 10% of the seeds in an area. You're going to want to take just a few seeds from a bunch of different individuals. And that's making sure that we are not harming the system in trying to bring some of these seeds back to our urban areas. And ensure that you are storing them somewhere that they can be dry. So plastic bags, not a good idea unless it's just, short term, you're just collecting them and you take them home later and dry them. But make sure you store them either in a paper bag or an envelope. The little coin envelopes that you can get from stationery stores work really well. That's what I've got in this picture here. Just for a few seeds, label it with your species, your year, where you got them from. That's a good way to go about it. So as I mentioned, your other option is to purchase seeds or seedlings from a reputable native plant seller. You're going to want to make sure that you are buying as close to home as you possibly can. So purchasing, native plant seeds from Ontario, they might be native in Ontario, they might not be native over here. So you're going to want to look for folks that are selling, if you're in Saskatchewan, buy from Saskatchewan. If you live in Hudson Bay and you think, oh, hey, that's a cool species, but it only grows in the Cypress Hills, that's still technically in Saskatchewan, but it's not really native to the same areas. So just things to keep in mind, because the closer you are to home, the better genetics you're going to get for your specific area. And overall, in terms of the ecology of our province and the movement of genetics and that kind of thing, the more local we can source our seeds, the better for all of that. So the Native Plant Society of Saskatchewan has a really great resource on their website. It's the Native Plant Material and Services Supplier List. I believe it's being updated right now, and I don't know if the new version is up yet, but you can watch for that. The link is here on the page, and I've also got it at the end of the presentation. So they have a list of a whole pile of reputable native plant sellers from, mostly Saskatchewan, but also Alberta, Manitoba. They also have sort of an index by species. So if there's a particular species that you're interested in growing and you want to find seeds or plugs for that, you can look it up by species and then, find which sellers have those and go to them. And so just a note on growing or adding seedlings to your garden is please never dig anything up from the wild, even if it's from a ditch. It's never a good idea. Like I mentioned a couple of times, the extensive root systems of our native species go far beyond any hole that you could ever dig. So by trying to dig something up from the ground, you're already damaging its own root system. But if you think of all the neighboring plants that have roots that are crossing that same zone, you're also damaging those neighboring plants. You're potentially leaving a hole in the ground where invasive species can very easily find that and get established. You're potentially bringing invasive species, rhizomes in that soil with you back to your site. So digging plants up from the wild, that's just a big no. Find somebody that is growing these things that you want, and support local and buy from them. And they'll also be happy to provide you with lots of information and knowledge. We have great folks locally that sell native species, and I do have some resources at the end of the presentation to have a look at. So once the plants are established, they really don't need much care. You're going to water them while the plants are establishing their roots, whether they're seedlings or seeds. Once they're nice and established, usually after, if you've got seedlings, after probably about 2 to 3 weeks, they should be okay, unless there's a really prolonged drought. Just check on them. But past that, they should generally be okay. And then seeds, again, just make sure they're not drying out. But you are going to have to keep up with that weeding. Like I said, invasive species don't stop taking over just because there's native species there. And then because when we're growing some of these species in areas where there's no other competition, just a bare flower bed patch, some of them can get quite robust, we'll say, quite large and sort of bushy and spread because they have no competition. So you may want to look at cutting them back once they're established. Again, depending on the aesthetic that you want, let them go wild, that's perfectly fine. But again, if you're looking for a neat and tidy option, you just might want to keep an eye on them because sometimes they do really take off and get a lot bigger than we're used to seeing them out in the wild. So lawn alternatives is a question I often get. And of course, there are some great native species that we can use in our lawns. And there are some grasses, but there are also some wildflowers that I said wildflowers again, flowers that can make some great low cover alternatives. So our grasses that we would typically use in the prairie are blue grama grass, June grass, and then our some of our upland sedges like the thread-leaved and the low sedges are great to mix in there as well. And then some of our forbs include yarrow and pussy toes. Oh, and I forgot buffalo grass, sorry, with the grasses there. So yarrow is the picture that I have here, and when it's mowed, it actually makes quite a nice low ground cover. Right now, you could probably just walk up to anybody's lawn and find yarrow in it, unless they spray it extensively for weeds, because yarrow likes to grow in lawns as it is, although lots of people think it's a weed. But it is. We do have a native yarrow species, so that's a great lawn alternative. And pussy toes will flower also, but the flowering stalks are usually, fairly small, and the leaves just make a nice low spreading ground cover. So I do have example here on the lower left is it's the native grass lawn, and that is unmowed. So when you select the right species, they don't get very high, and you can get away with not mowing it at all, or maybe once a season, maybe twice a season, depending what you're after. And the picture on the top right there is same yard. That's just after it's been mowed. So we're going to get into some of the species now. I have this little chart here to sort of show you some good options if you're starting out, of things that are fairly easy to grow. Full sun, partial shade, whether you've got a really dry site or a bit more moisture. I have this again in a few slides, so I can leave it up for a couple minutes if folks are writing notes or need time to screenshot something or something like that. But I'm just going to put it here to show you that we do have a number of different plants that are easy to grow that we can make work for different conditions. So I've organized this sort of by height, I guess, in terms of showing you the pictures. And then later on, I also have a little slide with a chart that will show you sort of progressive bloom times for some of these species. And again, whether you've got shade and sun and all that kind of thing, that little chart that I just showed you. So my height categories are low, mid-height, and then tall. And take them with a grain of salt, because again, some of these species get quite robust in conditions where they're not competing with other species. So, something that should have been low growing, perhaps that normally grows in sandy soils, but you've put it in clay by itself, it might just go crazy on you. It can be a little bit of an experiment when you're growing this stuff in your yard, but so the categories are a little bit general, but just to give you an idea. So some of our low growing species, we have pussy toes, and that's the one that I just mentioned as a good lawn alternative. Those are the flowers, and you can see the silvery leaves that are growing underneath there. Prairie crocus is a great one, and that's a nice and early flowering species, usually April. That's always a fun one to see come up in your garden, and then see all the ants and the bees and everything emerge to come and pollinate it also. Three-flowered avens or prairie smoke in the top of the middle there. That's another fairly low growing one. The flowers get a little bit higher, but the leaves stay quite low. Prairie golden aster in the bottom center there is a lovely yellow daisy looking flower, and it tends to stay rather low growing. It likes sandier soils, but I've grown it in my clay soils, and it survived. It wasn't really happy, but it's possible. And then Canada violet usually stays relatively low, and that's a decent one if you have some shade for your site, that it will still do okay. So in our mid-height category, we have everything from yarrow to bergamot, which folks like bergamot because you can make tea out of the leaves. Gaillardia, which is my absolute favorite. I tend to grow it basically wherever I can. Canada anemone is a good one if you have some shade. Yarrow will do okay in the shade, and so will bergamot, and our wild blue flax, and prairie coneflower. I have a second slide here for mid-height, just because there were so many good options, and I couldn't leave stuff out. And even after I was done these slides, I still thought, oh, I haven't put these things in, but I have to cut it off somewhere. So our dotted blazing star on the top left there is a nice mid-height one. Heart-leaved Alexander's likes a little bit more moisture, so if you have a site that tends to collect a bit of water, that's a good species there. Hyssop is probably one of the best plants to grow if you're interested in having bees in your yard. It will be absolutely covered in bees once it starts flowering, and it's just an absolute hive of activity. It's so much fun to watch. Wild columbine is an early flowering species, so usually in May. That's a nice one for mid-height, and it will also take some shade. And then we have our prairie sage and also pasture sage, which I didn't put on here if you're looking for a bit of that silvery foliage in your garden. And purple coneflower, also called echinacea. And then for our tall species, just a few here. Smooth aster is another really great one for pollinators. In the top center there, it has a really lovely deep to lilac purple flower. Stiff goldenrod, and there are several other goldenrod species as well. The stiff goldenrod likes full sun, but you can get things like Canada goldenrod that will tolerate a bit more shade. and then prairie sunflower, which is an annual species. So that one will flower when you plant it because it only has 1 year to get through that. And black-eyed Susan, which admittedly looks similar to our sunflowers, but it's a little bit different, and it's more of a short-lived perennial. So when I say tall, these species can get to a good meter and up, again, depending how much competition or how happy they are at the site. I have a few shrub recommendations. So we have a lot of native fruit shrubs that grow in Saskatchewan. Saskatoons, chokecherries, raspberries, our thorny buffalo berry in the prairie. And I didn't label these, but so top left we have red osier dogwood, which is also a species, or top left, did I say top left? I can't remember. Anyway, you can find that one commonly at garden centers, but again, if your aim is for native species, I suggest you get it from a native plant seller. Top middle, we have a prairie rose there. Top right, we have wolf willow. Bottom right, we have prairie cinquefoil, or shrubby cinquefoil also. And then in the bottom middle, I guess we'll call that, is a Saskatoon. We also have silver sagebush is native. What haven't I mentioned? Yeah, there's lots of good options, although shrubs are a little bit harder to find. But again, I have a resource at the end there if you're looking specifically for shrubs. There is one particular place anyway to check out, so we'll talk about that when we get there. I do have folks asking me about edible plants, edible native plants that they can grow in their yards. So I did put together a bit of a slide here. I would just caution that, as with any plant, you have to be absolutely sure what you're growing and absolutely sure what you're consuming. Some things can be poisonous if you have too much of them. Some parts of a plant might be poisonous and other parts might be edible. So I put this up with a bit of caution that I'm not an ethnobotanist. I haven't given you any specifics here. These are just some ideas to get you started, but I would strongly suggest that if this is something that interests you, that you do a lot of further research. I've got some books at the end that are great for that. And just the one thing that I absolutely want to point out on this slide, where I have wild onion under the other, because you can eat sort of the leaves and the bulb of wild onion. However, I've got a big caution there. There are look-alike species that are deathly poisonous, that if you mix them up, it would be not good. And so again, just make sure absolutely you know what species you have, what you're eating, how much, or however you're consuming it if you're making tea and that kind of thing. Do your research on this and talk to somebody that's knowledgeable with ethnobotany. But here's a list to sort of get you started in your digging, and hopefully that'll be a good place to get going. My next slide is just a little bit of caution about a few of our native species. So despite the fact that they are native, some of them are still aggressive spreaders. Milkweed is a very popular plant right now because of its association with monarchs, and that's great. However, our showy milkweed is a very aggressive spreader. It will stay put for maybe 2 to 3 years, and then all of a sudden it will start spreading. Wild mint is a spreader, yarrow is a spreader, prairie and pasture sage, and our star-flowered Solomon seal, which is what I have in my picture here. I took this picture because my dog was sitting in my native plant bed, and I thought it was hilarious, and also not funny at the same time. However, it made a really great illustration. The picture that I have, or sorry, the plant that I have the pink circle around, that's the star-flowered Solomon seal. I started this patch with 2 plants, and honestly, when I started it a long time ago, I really hadn't considered the fact that it was a bit of a spreader, and you can sort of see the extent there with the red line of where it's spread to so far, and it was really only kept in check by the fact that I had some other relatively competitive species around it, but it was actually popping up under my deck, which this flower bed is right beside my deck, because there was nothing else under there. So that one is a really great spreader. So if you want to have these species in your yard, but you're concerned about their spread, one thing that you can do is plant them in a pot with the bottom cut out and put the pot into the ground, and that will basically act like a barrier to the rhizomes for some of the species that spread by rhizomes. And for other things, I would suggest that after they're done flowering, you can just clip the seed heads to make sure that they're not self-seeding and spreading themselves that way. So here we have a little illustration of some sort of progressive planting and things that will bloom over the season. So we've talked, or we've seen pictures about, I think all of these species so far, maybe not the beer tongue. But again, if you want some early flowering species, prairie crocus and three-flowered avens are great. Things that are much later in the fall, smooth aster and some of the goldenrods will flower into September, sometimes October. So you can really get a variety and watch your garden change over time with some of these different species and their flowering. And the nice thing about planting a good variety is that you will continue to get different pollinators visiting your garden over time, and you're always providing something for them to come back to. So for my next few slides here, I just have some examples to show you other places that have done, somewhat larger, oh, I guess not all of them are large, plantings. This is the First Nations University in Regina, and they've recently sort of revived their native species beds, but unfortunately I haven't had the chance to visit lately, so I'm not sure what they're like. In this picture you can see quite a lot of bergamot and prairie coneflower in flower. Here we have a private yard in Saskatoon. We've got black-eyed Susan, prairie coneflower, showy aster, echinacea, purple prairie clover, blazing star, and bergamot also. Yard in Regina, some of the similar species. There's a goldenrod in the top right there. I think that's probably Canada goldenrod. In the center, we've got purple prairie clover, and there's a sunflower on the left-hand side. And I don't think that's the prairie sunflower. I'm pretty sure that's a different species, but I'm honestly not sure which one she planted. This is a shot of my own yard, or at least my former yard, because we've moved since then. In the front, we've got some pussy toes growing. I've got heart-leaved Alexanders. The red stuff is either wild columbine or three-flowered avens. There's blue flax coming up there. The crocuses have gone to seed. And we have a school project in Regina that I've worked on. And this bed is really aimed at having a pollinator garden, as also supporting some First Nations traditional uses of plants. So it's a rather wild looking flower bed. As you can see, it's sort of just left to do what it's going to do. So it does come out very, very bushy with a lot of blooms and sort of even spills over the garden beds. But it's a really lovely spot. And the Royal Saskatchewan Museum in Regina also has a bed that they have been rejuvenating over the past few years. They've got some new signage up there. So if you haven't visited this site in a few years, I would suggest that you go have a look. It's also a great place in some of these educational beds because they have markers to show you what species are, so you can really get a sense of what they look like and how tall they get and all that kind of thing. So if you're ready for your screenshots now, here's our chart again. I often get questions about, lots of our prairie species like the full sun, but what I have shade, what can I grow in the shade? If you have a conifer tree that nothing grows under, you're still going to have a hard time getting some of the stuff to grow, but you might get it to survive. It's just not going to be really happy. But partial shade, the ones I've marked there, the mint, the anemone, smooth aster, Alexander's, columbine, Canada violet, and bergamot can handle some shade. And then most of those can also handle a little bit of extra moisture. So for some resources here, Blazing Star in Saskatchewan, Prairie Originals in Manitoba, and the ALCLA native plants in Alberta are three that I have experience with that have been great. And I'm not trying to, I have no affiliation with any of these folks. It's just that I've personally used them and found them to be great to deal with. And they also have great resources on their websites. So if you're looking for a seed mix of something that's great for full sun, very dry soil, often they will have lists of those things and show you the pictures and all that kind of thing. If you're after shrubs, I would suggest contacting the Shan Greenhouse because they do grow a number of shrubs. If you have an acreage or a farm, they are able to potentially provide some help with shelter belts and that kind of thing. And we also have a Facebook group which I would encourage you to look up, where it's specific for Saskatchewan, but discussing certain, well, anything related to growing native plants really, and some of the things that come along with that. We've got a couple of books on the right here that talk a lot about ethnobotany and some of the uses of some of our native plants. So if that's something that interests you, I would suggest looking up those books. You can find all of these books on the Native Plant Society of Saskatchewan website, incidentally, if you want to get them all for one place. Cultivating Our Roots is really about growing native species by Nora Stewart. It's a great resource. She's also got pictures in there of what the seedlings look like. So if you're weeding things and you're having a hard time determining what's native and what's not, that's a great resource. There's also the Native Plants for Gardens there. Just a thank you to folks for providing photos for this presentation. And then just I'll leave the take-home messages up there for you guys. And that's what I have for you today. So thanks. I'm happy to take questions if we have a few minutes, looks like maybe. And again, if there's something I didn't cover and can't get to your question today, come find the Facebook group. I'm on there, and there's lots of other knowledgeable folks also that can help with questions and whatever you might be wanting to discuss also. So thanks everyone, and happy planting.
Thank you so much for the awesome presentation. It was really, really informative, and the pictures of your gardens look way more beautiful than mine. I'm really inspired. Thank you so much for sharing all of those resources as well. We do have some questions in from our listeners. So one listener named Julie says, do you recommend pasture sage in a lawn or any vetches?
That's a good question. Yeah, you know what, we do have some low growing vetches that would probably do all right. I find some of the vetches and the milkweeds are a little bit harder to source sometimes. So you might have a bit of a trickier time trying to find them. And the pasture sage, the sages would do okay if you kept them mowed. The only problem I could see is that if you're using it, in the sense of a traditional lawn where your kids are out there playing or you're wanting to go barefoot, they do have fairly woody bases, so it might not be great on the feet. But if it's just more of sort of an aesthetic place where you're not spending a lot of time walking on it, if you mow down the plants, they will spread, and you can sort of keep the seed heads from coming up. They would be good in there as well.
Okay. And Linda's wondering if you know where to find sweetgrass in your Saskatoon.
So I would encourage you to look up that Native Plant Society of Saskatchewan seed supplier list. I'm pretty sure sweetgrass is in there. If you wanted to go see it in the wilds, I do believe you can find it in the northeast swale. However, I guess I would caution folks about picking it from our natural areas, because that's a conservation site. So to go see it, perfectly fine. I would perhaps consult some folks about, if you're wanting to collect it, finding a site where it's suitable to do that.
Absolutely, that makes sense. And one listener's wondering if it's a good idea to use their own soil when growing seeds.
Sure, yeah. Like I said, if you're planting a bed, you don't need special soil. Or I guess maybe if we're talking about seedlings,
like maybe start them,
growing things inside, that's a bit of a tricky one, because of course with soil you're getting from the outdoors, there's going to be all kinds of fungi and things in there, which when it's outside, it's going to be kept in check. If you bring it into a sort of an ideal, warm, moist environment, it might get a little out of hand, and it might actually be detrimental to your species. That's why all of the soil mixes that we buy are usually sterilized to sort of keep the fungi down while you're trying to get those plants established. When I've grown things in pots, I've certainly mixed my own soil into them with my other soil mixes. So you can try it, but if you're wanting, I guess, to maximize success, I would suggest going with the sterilized mix, just to make sure that you're not inviting the fungi to really take over your seedlings.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of work, and yeah, set yourself up for success. Yeah. Another listener is wondering, when is the best time to start the seeds if you plan to plant in the fall?
So if you're going to do a fall seeding,
Mhm.
you're going to want to get, close to frost. If you put them in too
Okay.
early, you're going to have probably, birds and small mammals, potentially eating them on you, especially because we keep them right at the soil surface, right? So, if snow is coming, maybe, like prepare your soil bed ahead of time, make sure there's, you're weed free and that kind of thing. And if snow is coming, I would say get out there, stomp your seeds into the ground, and let the snow cover it, sort of as soon as possible. So yeah, probably just before snow is coming is kind of the ideal time.
Okay. Perfect. And Tanya's wondering if you would recommend using any fertilizer at all, or just to leave native plants to do their thing.
Nope, fertilizer will just help the weeds in this case. Our
Okay.
native plants, again, the roots are down there so deep, they're not even really in a place to access the fertilizer at all. The fertilizer, being mostly at the surface, is just going to help those annual weed seeds that blow in to be happier, and we don't want to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Another listener says that they got their seeds from Blazing Star, and the company recommended mulch, so they put mulch down. And is that okay in your opinion? And do you know how long seeds last? Like, would it be just a few years or just one? Can a person hang on to a few in case it didn't work this year and replant next year?
Sure. So, I mean, most of our native species have a relatively long dormancy period. So, hanging on to seeds for a few years, definitely. I've planted things, I collected in 2011. Um, and as long
Wow.
as they haven't been sort of exposed to moisture and heat, or all of those things that might have broken their dormancy, they should be good to go.
Okay.
I guess I'm not clear on the situation for using mulch, like around a seedling maybe, so that you don't have to water it quite so much while it gets established, or if they were talking about putting it over a seed bed, which I couldn't see being helpful, because those seeds are going to need the light, and that would essentially smother them, I would think. So yeah, if you're mulching around seedlings to give them a better chance to establish without having to water as often, I could definitely see that. Just make sure that you're sourcing a mulch that is weed free. Otherwise, all your hard work to get rid of that stuff ahead of time is going to be undone by bringing in more weeds.
Absolutely. And Kaylee's asking about the chart that you posted there, if she'd be able to share it with credit. Would that be okay with you?
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely.
Looks like a great resource. I definitely use the screenshot feature on that. um, and Mesa's wondering if you would recommend a good companion plant for a breadroot or prairie turnip.
Um, that's a good question. I mean, hmm, it's not parasitic in any way, so
Mhm.
it wouldn't, like, it doesn't need, any particular species to be grown with it. Um, I mean, off the top of my head, because it tends to grow on exposed hillsides that are relatively well drained soils. So, a really good way to learn about that species and get a sense of what might do well with it is go walk in the prairie and see what's growing with it, right?
Yeah.
Things like blue grama grass and pussy toes and crocuses and moss phlox, which I didn't have pictures in there, but those are all things that you would find commonly on similar sort of dry, south-facing, well-drained sites. So those might be good options. But yeah, get out there and have a look and see what grows with it in nature, and see if you can source seeds for those plants.
Okay, great suggestion. There's a couple listeners wanting to know that have questions about identifying plants. One about grasses, like if you have native grass and then other planted grass that comes in. Do you have a resource about grass or another one about like dandelions and other edible plants in the yard?
Okay. I mean, in terms of non-native species, I don't tend to follow along with sort of just the general weedy stuff that you find, like the portulacas and that kind of thing.
Mm,
I know some of that stuff is edible, but I can't really make any recommendations on that. For
okay,
the native species, I would say, like, check out those books that I mentioned.
Native Plant
Um,
Society. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And in terms of grasses, I mean, if you're a beginner, IDing grasses when they're not flowering can be very, very tricky because you have to look at very small things on the grass. And we tend to mow things before they go to flower, right, for our grasses.
Mhm.
There is I mean, there's the Grasses of Saskatchewan book
With
that the
this one.
Flora of Saskatchewan has. And so that's sort of the the resource for identifying grasses, but it's
Mhm.
also perhaps a bit much for a beginner. The Range Society for Range Management might have some resources there, or the Saskatchewan
Saskatchewan
Forest Council.
Council. Yeah, I've got this one right at my desk here, and it was out of print for a while, and I put my name in big letters. I'm like, I'm keeping this.
Yeah,
But like you said, you do for some of the plants without the seed head, you have to really get down to some of the
yeah,
detailed botany. But it is a good resource for grasses for sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Great, thanks. And I see that we're kind of running out of time here. There's been quite a few more questions, so I'll just let people maybe get a hold of you directly, or go through some of the resources that you've recommended there. And there's been lots and lots of people who've typed in, thank you so much for the presentation, how much they loved it. So yeah, I just want to reiterate all of their comments, and thank you for taking the time today, Sarah, to share all of your knowledge and expertise with us, and for all of the hard work that you're doing. So thank you, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks all of our listeners for catching our webinar today. Just want to remind you to check out our PCAP website for other events going on this week. We also have a photo contest on social media, and we've got votes. You can vote for your native prairie photo contest. We've got a number of different categories. This webinar, along with other ones, are recorded and put onto the PCAP YouTube channel. So check that out. That's youtube.com/user/SKPCAP. And when you leave today's webinar, you might get a survey. If you don't mind filling that out, we really appreciate it. So then we know what to do for next year. And hopefully next year we'll be back in the field. If not, we'll probably have another virtual event. So we always like to have people's feedback. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.